Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second thematic session of the One Planet track about environmental risk assessment for pesticide transitioning to a system-based approach. I'm Vanessa Mazrol. I'm the head of the Environmental Fate and Ecotoxicology unit dealing with fertilizer and plant protection product at ANSES in France. And I'm a risk assessor in ecotoxicology since 20 years. And today I will be one of the chair of this session.
Hello. Hello, my name is Sylvia Pieper. Thanks. Yes, I'm a co-chair with Vanessa of this session. I'm also leading an ecotoxicology and environmental risk assessment at a German agency for environment. We have a department on pesticides, and there is also a section there on fate and behavior of active substances. I'm an ecotoxicologist by training with a focus on soil ecotoxicology. The first part of this session will be moderated by Vanessa, and I will take then the second part. Thank you, Vanessa. Go there.
Thank you, Sylvia. So, as in kind of introduction, as you know, the regulated products are subject to environmental risk assessment worldwide. And the adequacy of the current system seems to have some limits because we all know that biodiversity loss is a fact. So further advancing environmental risk assessment could contribute for sure to support the UN Sustainable Development and EU Green Deal goals to safeguard our environment. So this session will explore the current environmental risk assessment paradigm, what we know, why is there a need to change, if there any need to change, we will see later. We will explore the scientific opportunities and challenges that offer a new paradigm for the environmental risk assessment and the use of a system-based approach that could be used by multi-stakeholder scientists, regulatory scientists, policy, society. So this session is organized in 3 parts. So the first part will be an overview of the issue raised by the current system and explore the need of change. Then we will go to a second part that will be chaired by Sylvia. Will be more about how to deal with the option we have that could contribute to facilitate a transition and shift of paradigm. So more how this could be done, which tool do we already have, do we need to develop. And finally, we will have a panel discussion on the possible way forward and the views of different stakeholders on how to implement a system-based approach for environmental risk assessments. So that's the aim. We will have a lot of in-person speakers, so we are very pleased for that. And just a kind of reminder before moving to the first part, you have an app, as you know already, where you could put comment, question. So there will be a question answer later after the first part of the session. So I invite you to already download, if not already done, the app. And there will be also a poll. So in 40 minutes, you will be invited to answer some questions. And so, yeah, download it if not done yet, please. So saying that, we will go directly to the first part of this session and the framing of issue. And for that, we are very pleased to introduce Professor Jeroen van der Sluijs. Jeroen is professor at the Center for the Study of the Science and the Humanities at the University of Bergen, Norway. And his presentation, Jeroen will explore broadening the scope of future environmental risk assessment of pesticide by lessons learned from the neonicotinoid case. So, Jeroen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So in my lecture, I will talk about what we can learn from the neonicotinoid case. These are systemic insecticides. And this has been a case study in a European project, the Recipes project, on the future of the precautionary principle in Europe. So 60 years ago, Rachel Carson, in her book Silent Spring, warned already for the systemic pesticides. She sketched this nightmare scenario where bees will bring poisonous honey to the hive. And that is what happened after the neonics came on the market. So we have been in a pesticide merry-go-round. The book by Rachel Carson was about DDT. DDT was banned after many years. Then it was replaced by other pesticides that then typically after 15 to 20 years were also banned and replaced by new ones that after 20 years were also banned, etc. So the episode I will talk about now is the systemic insecticides or the neonicotinoids. So you see seeds coated with these chemicals because they are used prophylactically, these pesticides. So it means it's a convenience pesticide. It's the antithesis of integrated pest management because it's a preemptive strike and it's not a last resort where we use the chemical. The chemical is taken up by the plant and makes the plant toxic from the inside. So on the bottom, on the right, you see the toxicity. These chemicals, the three on the bottom, are neonicotinoids, or the four almost. And these are 7,000 times more toxic for bees than DDT. So if we look at the amount of pesticides used, it's the red line. It goes down in kilograms. But because these pesticides have become so much more potent, the toxicity is much higher. So we see what drives the toxicity of farmland, that's the lower graph, is mainly these neonicotinoid insecticides. And it's also used on more land, that's the blue line. In the same period that the neonics went up, we see a steep decline in wild bees. So in the period between 2006 and 2015, 25% fewer species of wild bees have been observed globally than was the case before 1990. We also see dramatic declines, sharp declines in aquatic insects. This is a case from the Netherlands where we see continuous violations of the water quality standards for neonicotinoids in many, many successive years, all the red dots on the map. And it was in more than half of all the water samples over the whole country that the norm was violated. And we saw 70% less aquatic insects in the water samples that were over the norm. And we see in the same areas also a sharp decline in insectivorous birds that feed on insects. So in the timeline of the neonicotinoid case, the 1991, it was first introduced worldwide on the market and also in Europe in 1992. And then already in 1994, the early warnings came from the beekeepers in France. And then we see the first ban already in 1999, even before the EFSA was established in sunflowers in France and later in mice. And then we see an important report in France from a Scientific Technical Committee from 2003, and it has all the knowledge that would give us all the warnings that it's not safe to use this according to the label because we exceed the no effect concentration in the field, and this led to the ban in France on the use in corn. But in the same period after 2003, we see an explosion of permissions of use of these chemicals in Europe. Until 2013, the EU starts reacting on the early warning signals, but then it's late action. The 3 neonics were banned in crops attractive to bees in 2013, and in 2018 it was banned for all outdoor use in crops. And in 2019 also thiacloprid, a fourth neonicotinoid, was banned for health reasons. But we have loopholes because even after the ban, neonics continue to pollute our environment also in Europe, partly because emergency authorizations, but that's not the main source, It's mainly because the use as biocide continues. For instance, sprays used in cattle breeding, which are not crops, so it's still allowed. Also used as veterinary medicine on pets and cattle. It's also used outside the EU on food, and that continues, and then it's not fully metabolized, so it also comes in the urine and then in the wastewater and all the rest. And there is a lot of regrettable substitution with other similarly harmful chemicals, such as sulfoxaflor. And there are now new markets. Last year, Norway opened the use in salmon farming, and 3.5 tons of pure imidacloprid have been used in the first half year of allowance in Norway. So we see some challenges. Too little, large-scale use and pollution continues. So we have to fix the loopholes. It's too late. There were too much delays between the early warning and actions. So we need also to improve what is called the social organization of expertise, such that this knowledge about the harm comes earlier to the decision makers. The partial ban is only in Europe. The worldwide use is still growing rapidly. Europe produces and exports the banned neonics for uses that are banned in Europe, and it's allowed to produce and export this from Europe, which is crazy. And then we see that the human exposure is still high, also in Europe, and probably rising. And it's also marked as a pollutant of emerging concern in the marine and even the Arctic environments where we find it now. So we see a list of historic errors in the risk assessment of neonics from which we can learn. First, the assessments assumed that it did not translocate to the flowers. That was in the 90s. Then the academic scientists like Jean-Marc Bonnetin and other colleagues there detected it in pollen and nectar at the parts per billion level. Then there was discussion, but is it dangerous at the parts per billion level? And originally the authorization assessment said no, but then academics proved sublethal effects even at part per trillion levels. So the honeybee is seen as representative to protect bees, but it's not. The honeybee is the most resilient bee because the colony is exceptionally big and can just handle a lot of stress. We see that field tests can overrule lab tests, but field tests are not even reproducible, and the lab tests are clear enough to give the signal that we have to stop this use. And then the assessment assumes single application of a single substance in a one-time exposure. And that led to the allowance of 1,000 allowed applications of 6 different neonics in 200 products in the EU. So it means it's used on almost all crops, and the exposure is year-round and not a single time. Then there was this discussion, should we allow for recovery in the tests if the bees lose part of their colony, but they can recover, etc. So here's about the irreproducible of the field test. I see I'm running out of time. A 3-kilometer radius around a honeybee hive. Try to reproduce the same diet because the vegetation is so different. And then in order to detect, for instance, a 35% effect size, you already need an experiment with 74 hives. And then each hive needs a 3-kilometer radius. So you need a tremendous amount of land. That is not realistic, so why not just use the knowledge we have from the lab tests? So what goes wrong is the reduction of the problem. The problem, how do we produce food, or are pesticides safe for bees, in endpoints and concrete tests that are then protocolized in the EFSA and used by the industry to create their authorization dossiers. And in this translation, all the relevant information about the damaging impacts get lost. And in the end, we can check all the boxes and it crosses all the tests and it can be authorized. And then there is no limit. There is not even an emission ceiling. It can be used, if the decision is yes, it can be used at any conceivable scale. So it will be used at the maximum possible scale. So here is one of the things that were overlooked. It was not the acute toxicity that was relevant, but the sublethal effects. If bees are exposed to a sublethal dose, they lose their capacity to navigate and cannot fly back to the hive, and this radar tracking experiment showed this very clearly, but of course it could not be used for a ban because it was not in the EFSA guidance. So in the recipes project that I mentioned, we developed a guidance for the application of the precautionary principle. It covers scope of application, organization of expertise, and participation. So the precautionary principle is evidence-based, evidence-informed action on uncertain risks, and that requires scientifically underpinned grounds for concern to act, and then you have to make clear who gets the benefit of the doubt. That is a policy choice that should be made explicitly. So this means also that the precautionary principle is often seen as a principle for the risk managers, but that's not enough. If we have to detect situations that require precautionary action, and if we want to follow them up rapidly, then risk assessment needs to be well informed by the precautionary principle. So that means that we need well-organized and timely collection of actionable knowledge that allows us to act when there are signals that we have to act. This also requires pluralization of expertise in the scientific assessments, because we see often that the expertise that is key to understanding the new and surprising new effects of new chemicals come from other domains than the ones that are dominant in the present risk assessment. So we have to engage with wider ranges of knowledge holders, and we have to respect the other ways of knowing and forms of knowledge. So we need what we call a turn to epistemic pluralism in the risk assessment. So if I had a third keyword for the word cloud later on, I would put there epistemic pluralism. So risk assessment must then also be open to what is called non-standard knowledge. So our case study in this European recipes project on the future of precautionary principle in Europe, the case study on neonics, it showed that there were many blind spots based on the overly reductionist risk assessment protocols used. And we see that knowledge that does not fit these protocols, and then we talk about endpoints that are not covered by the protocols, like bees that lose their capacity to navigate. That type of knowledge is downplayed, marginalized, or ignored. Also, for instance, because it scores low on a CLIMESH index, or it doesn't have a GLP certificate, which is only a guarantee for good laboratory bookkeeping, but not for a high-quality design of the risk assessment experiments. But still, that leads to a biased way of evidence. So too often we see that coalitions of concerned scientists and societal actors need to step up and break the script in order to recognize key uncertainties and the potential of harm. We saw this in the case of DDT with Rachel Carson. We saw it in the case of neonics with a group of concerned scientists, including myself. So lessons learned, we see, and you saw that from the slide with the water pollution in the Netherlands, so many years with so extreme violation of the surface water norms, violations more than 1,000 times the norm in many places in the greenhouse, the glass areas in the west of the Netherlands, and there is no feedback on the authorization. We went with this to the Dutch authority, the CTGB, the Dutch EFSA, you could say. And they said, we cannot do anything about this because we cannot point which concrete authorization decision caused this. Was it the use in tulips? Was it the use on carrots? Was it the use on whatever? We cannot pinpoint it to a single application, so we cannot do anything. This is a real system error if such a violation does not lead to a stop of the use of this product, or at least a reduction in the volume of use, to put an emission ceiling, but even that was not discussable. So we see that power asymmetries bias the weighting of evidence in the risk assessment, and this is the result of an intensive industry lobby And we hope to organize a seminar on that later this year to mark 60 years Silent Spring, also here in Brussels, probably on 6 October. And then there's epistemic diversity of the knowledge base that is not accounted for. I told a little bit about that already. So we see that important knowledge is systematically silenced, downplayed, and ignored. And the full spectrum of available knowledge should be taken into account, so we need a system that is capable of engaging with other knowledge systems. So we also have to make thorough knowledge quality assessment a key task in the risk assessment at the science policy interface, and make use of information from non-scientific sources, such as beekeepers and farmers. And also we need more clarity of the values, clarify the values that are at play, the stakes and the vested interests that play a role in how pesticides are assessed. So, to conclude, it means that we need actionable knowledge that helps us to take precautionary action faster and more effectively than we have done in this eternal cycle of allowing pesticides on the market and then responding too late to early warnings and banning them only after 20 years, while they should never have been allowed on the market in the first place. So actionable knowledge is knowledge that is fit for informing precautionary decision-making and action. It resonates with the concerns for which it is raised. So it starts from the matters of concern or the matters of care, and not only from the matters of facts. And then from the matters of concern, we find out what facts are salient, important, and relevant. So it requires explicit and transparent problem scoping and setting the boundaries of the problem wide enough to include the concerns of those affected. So this session was about framing, and this point is the framing is very important in creating actionable knowledge, that the frame is wide enough to include all the concerns. So it should also include knowledge on the severity and nature of the potential adverse effects. It should have high attention for uncertainty in the knowledge, including the known and the unknown unknowns. Not only what can be quantified and put in numbers and can treat it with statistical methods. And then it also needs to have knowledge, active development of knowledge about alternatives of getting the same food production without toxics, for instance. So it's a cycle where we go from scoping to engaging with other knowledge holders to appraising the quality of the information, selecting the relevant knowledge, synthesizing this, sharing it, and in the end, knowledge stewardship. So then I come to my take-home keywords, and they will end up in the word cloud in the end. And that is, we need to move to a more holistic risk assessment based on the concept that I sketched of actionable knowledge for precaution. And then I have 19 seconds left, so that gives us a bit more transition to the next speaker. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Jeroen. I heard some words like we must be more open to other knowledge and so on, more explicit and be open mind to broader knowledge. So thanks is reason with some keywords we heard yesterday in the opening session already. So we are now ready for our second speaker. It's Annette Aldrich. She works as an ecotoxicology risk assessor for the authorization plant protection product in biocide and plant protection product section at the Federal Office of the Environment of Switzerland. So while the environmental risk assessment has been improved over the years by EFSA, the current approach seems to be no longer applicable. So why is there a need for a paradigm shift? Annette will explain us that. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. It's very nice to be here. Thank you. So the question is, why is there a need for a paradigm shift in the era, in the environmental risk assessment of pesticides? Well, this question implies really that there are limitations with the current system. Yeah, I'm a bit smaller. Sorry. Yes. So I would like to argue that those limitations also form the building blocks to create the new systems-based approach. We have the technology and the data to address those limitations and to create a next-generation environmental risk assessment. So what I would like you to picture at the end of my presentation is that we must and can develop a new systems-based approach based on a better usage of data and a better dialogue between the stakeholders. So let's start from the beginning. We have a very common situation. We have a crop with a pest, which may ultimately affect the quantity or quality of the produce. One way to deal with the situation is to spray a pesticide, which is actually one of the most important ways to protect a crop according to EU Regulation 1107/2009. The same regulation also states that the precautionary principle should be applied and that we should ensure that there's no unacceptable effects in the environment. This is the basic scheme of a prospective risk assessment, very simple. If the ratio of toxicity between toxicity and exposure is greater than the values laid down in the uniform principles, the risk is considered acceptable. This may be done after higher tier risk assessment. Otherwise, the authorization may not be granted. And this is done for every single group of organisms represented by surrogate species and for each exposure route separately. Indirect effects, for instance, between arthropods and birds are not assessed. So the outcome of this assessment is that we can manage single substances by imposing risk mitigation measures to address single exposure routes to protect single group of organisms. And this is what is defined as a safe use. So the justification of this very simple process, the single substance, single use, is a so-called worst-case approach. The surrogate species are assumed to cover the sensitivity of other species. The unaddressed aspects or uncertainties are assumed to be covered by the use of assessment factors. And a stepwise tiered approach is considered to be very resource efficient and focuses on the areas of concern. The advantage is that individual risk can be managed, but the assessment is considered very data-rich and is based on a very comprehensive and harmonized data requirement. And this standardized approach aims to be unbiased and to provide predictability to the industry. So to this end, the guidance documents harmonize the assessment and to consider the scientific knowledge, but still leave enough room for the expert judgment. So those are all these assumptions and positive aspects of the current approach. But simultaneously, these advantages are also being criticized because there's a time lag between the scientific development and the integration of new knowledge in the guidance documents. The addition of further species and exposure routes has led to an increased complexity in the overall assessment. And the tiered approach has led to incomparable assessments of similar substances because it leaves the notifier the choice to either submit more substances or more studies, or to accept risk mitigation measures. And the tiered approach has not been calibrated to field situations. The overall margin of safety is unknown because the effects are not added up over time and space. And the biodiversity is really said to be insufficiently addressed because the effects are addressed on an individual level and not on the ecosystem level. So the current system is criticized as relevant stakeholders are insufficiently involved, and it is regarded as too simplistic because it does not consider mixtures, indirect effects, or the exposure to other stressors. And finally, and maybe foremost, the lack of spatial temporal factors. And this really undermines the concept of recovery and the separate in-field, off-field assessment that we have. So in reality, non-target organisms are exposed to multiple substances in the field. A recent study in Germany has indicated that on average about 3 substances are applied at the same time on one field. And furthermore, substances move around. They don't just stay in one field. They interact. They're exposed to other stressors. So the safe use we have identified based on the single substance, single-use assessment may not always be safe in reality. So we therefore need to question if our assumptions hold true and how we can align the process better with the data that we have. So to optimize the current process, there are several ways to go about. We can increase the assessment factors. An additional factor of 3 or 10 has been suggested. We can test more species, such as amphibians, reptiles, or bats. And we can assess further exposure routes, such as guttation waters. We could continue and build on the current paradigm and implement new tools. The assumption of this approach is that with more data, the quality of the decision improves because the uncertainty decreases. But if we build on the current approach, we would, in my opinion, ignore a great deal of relevant knowledge that we have about the occurrence and effects of pesticides. We would become even more complex and an even more resource-intensive process, but still ignore the reality in the field. So let's look at the data that we have and which we're currently ignoring in our process. At the moment, each assessment is conducted in the same tiered approach. The knowledge that we have gained from the assessment of similar substances is partially integrated in the data requirements in the guidance documents. But generally speaking, we treat each assessment like a new assessment, and we start from scratch. We don't group similar substances. So here you can see the regularity acceptable concentration from neonicotinoids. The RAC for acetamiprid is considerably higher when it is based on a single substance assessment and differs significantly from the other substances than if we use a read-across approach. So we don't know really whether the toxicity or the difference between 2 substances stems from a different quantity or quality of data, or if there's a true difference between the substances. And this read-across approach gives a lot more comparable risk assessment than a single substance assessment. We know that crops have a different susceptibility towards pests and are therefore treated differently, but we don't consider that in the risk assessment. For instance, orchards are treated 14 times, whereas corn is only treated once, mainly with herbicides. So if non-target organisms are only exposed once in a season, their potential for recovery is much greater than if they're exposed multiple times. And if the acceptability of effects is our concern, then realities such as this need to be considered. Although we're discussing the prospective risk assessment, I think it's sensible to also consider the necessity of use. Some products are used ubiquitously because of their mode of action. For instance, glyphosate is a total herbicide which acts unspecifically against all plants. So the impact of this substance on the biodiversity on a national scale will be much greater than for a substance with a very specific mode of action, which is used to a much lesser extent. But yet, the current assessment for both uses is the same. The single substance ignores the landscape, yet entire regions are famous for their wines. If we conduct a risk assessment for vineyards, we do it for a single field, although it's obvious that the entire catchment is vineyards. We conduct the risk assessment the same way as for hops. In Switzerland, we have about 10 hop farmers cultivating 17 hectares. Vineyards are cultivated on 15,000 hectares, but the risk assessment for both crops is exactly the same. We know that the landscape structure has a great impact on biodiversity. This is why ecological compensation areas are financially supported by the government. The non-target organisms react and recover differently depending on the landscape structure, and so the landscape structure can compensate or mitigate the effect of pesticides. But we currently assess all off-field areas the same and separate from in-field areas. We do not consider the habitat type or connectivity between habitats. The landscape in the risk assessment is theoretical. So the risk assessment is conducted for the edge of field. We assume that there's a stream next to every single field. In Switzerland, there's a legal requirement for a 3-meter buffer strip between a stream and the surface water. And this is what we calculate the exposure for the aquatic organisms. And if the input via drift has to be reduced, then risk mitigation measures up to 100 meters can be imposed. If the drift has to be reduced further, then the usage cannot be authorized. Yet in Switzerland, only about 0.6% of all agricultural lands lie within 6 meters of surface water, and 78% are further away than 100 meters. I think that this illustrates that on a national risk assessment without a landscape assessment, we may ban substances that do not actually pose the highest risk. So it seems that our drift, we base a risk assessment on ecotoxicological endpoints that derive from a dose-response curve. Yet these dose curves provide a lot more information that we ignore. So if we look at these two dose-response curves, the LC50 are the same. Yet a slightly higher concentration will cause a very different effect between these two substances. But the current assessment is done exactly the same way. And the endpoint we derive from these dose-response curves is at the end of the study. But if we want to assess the effects on the field, which occur in multiple times in space, then we need to know the time to onset of effects. And that is an information which is not passed on to the risk assessor. So as a last point, it seems to me that the general trend is to fix the limitations of the current authorization system by implementing strategies for reducing the risk of pesticides outside of the authorization system. The Green Deal requires a risk reduction of 50% by 2030, and this is basically mainly based on monitoring studies. In the authorization process, the risk assessors know which substance could be a concern based on the data that they have assessed, but this information, together with the pesticide usage data, is rarely passed on to the monitoring campaign in a timely manner. So to summarize, these limitations I just presented to you can form the building blocks for a new systems-based approach. They can be put into a storyline which describes the next generation risk assessment, which is an environmental risk assessment linked to agronomical reality at a landscape level, integrating ecology and a feedback loop to monitoring, and the output should feed into strategies and into the management. So to conclude, we have a lot more data and a lot more knowledge than we're currently using. And this data can help us to overcome these limitations and to have a more realistic risk assessment. And it can also help us to reduce the complexity if we change a paradigm. So what is needed is a departure from this one-way flow of information from the risk assessor to the risk manager to the farmer, disconnected from the monitoring. In order to move towards a system-based approach, we need to connect to stakeholders and expertise related to the prospective environmental risk assessment of pesticides. And for the development of such a system, we need the expertise, the knowledge, and the commitment from all stakeholders. We need to exchange data in a more beneficial and effective way to be protective, but still develop a simple environmental risk assessment. So this is what I would describe as a next generation environmental risk assessment. We would still use extensive tools, but not as currently done in a higher tier assessment, but right from the entry level, and place each assessment into realistic context. So you can see at this graph the type of data that needs to be exchanged and the necessary line of communication between the stakeholders. So the proposal for a new approach has been made in multiple papers, and further approaches will be developed in the PARC project under Horizon Europe. So in my opinion, a shift in paradigm towards a holistic and systems-based approach enables the farmer to take better informed decisions about the choice of pesticides due to increased comparability of the products. The risk manager will be better positioned to fulfill political strategies due to consideration of the landscape diversity. The risk assessor will have a better confidence about the reliability of the assessment. The agro-industry will better integrate agronomic expertise in the authorization process. And the consumer will better understand the quantity and quality of food versus pesticide risk. The monitoring campaigners will better anticipate potential areas of concern in future studies. And the scientist will better integrate research findings through an interactive approach. So I will finish off where I began. Relevant data, which is currently not being used, can contribute to a more protective and holistic environmental risk assessment. We have the technology to integrate this data and then focus the risk assessment on the critical parameters and thus achieve a simplified environmental risk assessment. I do not believe that by tinkering with the current system, we will improve the predictions. We need to change our current paradigm from a single substance, single-use assessment to a holistic, systems-based approach in order to tackle the current challenges and align with environmental realities and strategies. So I would like to acknowledge the work from the PERA team. EFSA has commissioned this project to develop the PERA roadmap, which provides a set of recommendations on the actions, steps, and resources needed to achieve EFSA's strategy to further advance environmental risk assessment. And you can see the outcome of this work on a poster presented in this conference, and you can also talk to my colleagues who are present here. So with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and for the organizers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annette, for this excellent speech. And always also remind me that with this shift of paradigm, we also can go to the one concept with one substance, one assessment. So this could be also one of the goals. So with this, we will close the first part for the speaker at least, because now we will have a poll and question-answer session. So we will go directly for the first question. So if you have the app, you will soon have the possibility to answer our questions, where we'll just explain you the question and maybe ask my speaker to reply. But I think I already know the answer. So the first question you will have on the poll is about, is a paradigm shift for the environmental risk assessment of pesticides needed? And you have 4 answers. You just select one. So there is yes, no, because the current system functions well, no, the current system can be further improved, or simply you do not know. But I think we already heard that. At least, Annette, I guess you will answer that. Yes, there is a need of change. No?
Yes, I'm supposed to answer or wait? Okay, sorry.
We can answer, yeah. And try if the audience will match with what we think.
Yeah, I do hope that my points that I've listed were clear enough to show that there really is a need for a paradigm shift and that it's possible to achieve this paradigm shift as well.
Okay, great. So I'll let you maybe a few seconds again to the app, and we can close the poll to see the result. I hope you all have made your choice. Oh, wait some second, it don't work. Okay, so we will work a little bit more. Okay, so maybe Jeroen, what do you think?
Yeah. It is probably not a surprise that my answer would be yes. Yeah.
Okay, I think mine too. And for the audience, is ready now, this people? Okay, then we can have the result of the... They are voting still. Okay, so I couldn't understand. Yeah, so we will go also for the question answer and so. So if I take one question, it's more for Jeroen probably. And Jeroen, how can we take into account the unknown in a scientifically robust way? One the question we have.
Yeah, that's a good question. The unknowns are the most hard to address, right? But one thing we have to think about is whether it is a case of what we call social construction of ignorance. Why are these unknown unknowns? And in the social science, that's another question. That can be a social science contribution. In the social sciences, we have described this phenomenon that the way we organize expertise and the way we fund research questions and don't fund other questions produces ignorance about all the things where we don't put money, where we don't invest in long ongoing research to explore these parts of reality. So in case of social construction of ignorance, if that is the reason that we have unknown unknowns, we can do something about it by being more smart in what kind of knowledge we produce. And the answer I gave in my lecture was to move from the matters of facts, what do we know now with the currently dominant ways of knowing, to the matters of concern. What is what we are concerned about, what is where we care for, and what kind of knowledge do we need to make sure that we can care for the environment, that we can care for the ecosystems, and that we can address the matters of concern by developing the knowledge that can help us there. The other answer would be to invest more in post-authorization monitoring of surprising impacts of the use of pesticides. And then also have a feedback from the monitoring to the authorization system, which is completely lacking at the present point, I think.
Thanks, Jeroen, a lot. So we can close the poll now, and we have our answers. So yes, so we will be happy now to have opened this session, and because okay, the audience say that we have 84% of people saying that yes, there is a need of paradigm shift in the environmental risk assessment. So it seems that yeah, people agree on that. So we can go to the second question of the poll you will have. What could a paradigm shift deliver in your view? And you have 6 answers possible, and you can make 3 choices. So do not hesitate to combine your thought about the different options we have. So deliver assessments that more easily integrate the latest scientific developments. Do you think that this shift could deliver assessments that are more integrated and takes better account of the context? Or do you think it's deliver assessments that make better use of the available data, including monitoring and surveillance? Or do you think it's deliver assessments that are comparable and harmonized across regulatory frameworks? All of the above is also an option, and none of the above is another option. So please. So the poll will be launched when we take some question and answer for the rest of the time. Yeah, there is a question about maybe more for Annette about the workload of this way of working that seems to be seen as enormous, and how could this be managed? Do you have any idea on that?
There definitely will be a workload, but the question is if the workload is going to be on the shoulders of the risk assessors or where we put that. And in the PERA vision, which you can see on the poster, we have developed certain different circles so to integrate all this knowledge. And I think what is happening down now, people are saying that a holistic risk assessment is going to be a lot more complex and is going to be a lot more resource intensive. But I think that ignores the fact that the current tiered approach is also rather resource intensive when we do the higher tier risk assessment, which we basically have to do for every single product when we assess the birds and mammals. So I think that the workload will shift. We will not have the higher tier studies so specifically for one product, but put that knowledge more as a basis for the risk assessment.
Yeah, they're still voting, but they are the right to continue to vote, please. The more we have as answer, the more valuable will be the result of the session also, so please continue to vote. Yeah, I don't know if it's for Annette or Jeroen, but any of us could take the floor. What is the role of the social science in environmental risk assessment of pesticides is of a question.
At the moment or in the future? That's probably...
It's not written, but at the moment and the future, we can answer both, I think.
Well, I do believe, I think we had a lot of discussion already mentioning of communication and the importance of communication and creating trust. And for me, the communication with the public is really why we do regulation, in order to install confidence in the public that we can use these substances in the same safe way. So yes, we do need social scientists to improve this communication, which is currently very much, well, I don't want to say maybe lacking, but it could be significantly improved.
Any view you learn about that?
Yeah, we need a shift to what is called a transdisciplinary approach, where we bring together all the academic and non-academic ways of knowing, including the social sciences, but also the humanities. And there it's important that the social sciences and the humanities are not seen as something instrumentally that comes in the end of pipe as a sort of lubricant to get the decisions accepted or so. But it is a way of knowing in its own right that has to be integrated in the transdisciplinary approach. And the role of social scientists is, for instance, very important in the problem framing phase, in mapping what are the relevant aspects of the problem that has to be addressed in the risk assessment. So where do we set the system boundaries, and what are the matters of concern that the risk assessment has to address?
Thanks a lot, Jeroen. So maybe we can close the poll now to have some answer from the audience. So if I read well, it seems that the IO score is too little for me. So we have the B as the first one. So it's deliver assessments that are more integrated and takes better account of the context, landscape, ecosystem. And the other one is more, all of them. So it seems that we have to really be open-minded to others, scientists, society, consumer, farmer, everybody, to be able to do this system-based approach in a way that we can answer and provide assessments that fit to all these goals. I think we have still the time for maybe one question. So there is someone asking for a comment on the Commission's proposal to cut the volume and risks of pesticide use by 2030 in the proposal for a revised directive on pesticide use released today. So is there any view, and do you think this system-based approach could also help us to achieve this goal, and how? So I don't know, Jeroen or Annette, if you want to say something.
I don't know the content of that particular proposal, so it's hard to comment on it. Yeah. Okay, yeah, but
We can just another one.
what is the question? To comment on it.
Yeah. So maybe if you want to, the person who proposed this, if you want to add something or come to discuss with us later. There is another question is about, is there also research about the consequence when a plant protection product isn't used at all? So, yeah, maybe for you, Jeroen.
Yes, there's a lot of research on that. There are, for instance, two reviews by Lorenzo Furlan and colleagues. I think both were published in Environmental Science and Pollution Research. And it shows that for major arable crops, there is almost no impact on yield if you don't use pesticides. And there are also alternatives such as insurance schemes between the farmers for the small risk that your yield will be lower in some cases if you don't use these pesticides. But this was about the neonicotinoid insecticides. I don't know so much about what is known about not using other pesticides such as fungicides and yeah. Okay, so maybe someone else can answer that question.
Yeah, I think we are running with time, so we will switch to the part 2. I would like to thank again Jeroen and Annette for the discussion, and thanks to the audience for the answer of the poll and also the comments. Thanks a lot to everybody, and I let the floor to Sylvia for the second part.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we will move to the second part of our session. And this second part is more concentrated on the transition path to a system-based approach. We have seen we have heard also in the speeches before, and also from the response from the audience, that there is a need to broaden the scope of ERA in order to be able to identify the relevant factors, the risks, and also to overcome the regulatory silos dividing the ERA of pesticides from other approaches, and then subdividing the assessment also between different uses and different organisms. So we will focus in this part less on the what need to be changes, but on the how. And we will have experts and presenters that will explore with us the scientific opportunities for facilitating the transition to a new paradigm. And we will see which frameworks, data, and models can be used to facilitate this transition. The contribution will be given in another format than before. These are pitch talks. Pitch talks are very short contribution of 10 minutes that concentrate on 1 or 2 questions and concentrate on delivering a take-home message for us, for the audience, and also for the discussion, then for the panel discussion. I would like to welcome on stage Violette Geissen. Violette Geissen is professor at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. She is professor for soil degradation and conservation. Your research focuses on the mechanism of soil degradation by pollutant, especially by diffuse sources, and on the strategy for effective land management. Your talk will be on a specific project, the SPRINT project. It's a Horizon 2020 project. And the SPRINT means Sustainable Plant Protection Transition, so it fits very well to the session. And it is a global health approach. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Maybe the microphone is on? Okay, thank you very much. Maybe the PowerPoint could as well appear. Okay, thanks a lot. More or less 2.5 years ago or 2 years ago, I went to the office in the morning and my colleagues told me, do you know, there is a new strategy from the European Commission, the Farm to Fork strategy. Oh, I said, what is this? Yeah, you will hear. what we have to do, what the Europe will do until 2030, we will reduce pesticides by 50%, and as well as the risk of pesticides. And I was saying, how? Are the tools there to do this? How we will do it? How we will estimate this? And then we were really lucky we got granted the Sprint project, and we have the opportunity to work in this project on potential tools and contribution to the Farm to Fork strategy. The Sprint project's approach is we will make a global health approach that includes ecosystem, animal, and human health. Today I will focus on the environmental health, but we as well will work on the transition and not on the era transition, no, but on the transition of the agricultural system. Because we believe that the agricultural system, which is now in Europe applied, is based on the ideas after the war. Produce as much as possible to never have hunger again. But we are 60 years further now. More people die on obesity than on undernutrition. So it's time for a change to Agriculture 2030. And what our ideas are on this, I will show you. In the Sprint project, the first question we were asking ourselves, how many pesticides are applied? Which pesticides are applied on which crops? That should be known. And we figured out it is not known. We tried to find out national databases. We were searching all over. No, it's not known. So what we did, we started in 10 different case study sites across Europe, and we have one in Argentina, to see what do farmers apply. Where are we talking about? We all know that we have about 500 different components in the European market, which are composed to about 2,000 different pesticides. What do you think? How many are applied per case study site? And we were here covering the European main crops. We have in each our case study sites 5 to 32 different components which are applied in one growing season. We checked this in 2022 by farmer interviews, together with Fiebel, the lady presented here in the morning, I think. We analyzed then 209 different components from the 500 on the market, and we wanted to know what do we find back in the environment. And we did a huge work on all these 10 different case study sites in Europe and one in Argentina. We were testing soil, water, sediment, air, dust, blood, feces, and urine. Vera, did I forget something? I think that was all. And so, what we wanted to know is, what is the so-called exposure? And then we wanted to know what is the risk then for the ecosystem, animals, and human health. So, as I said, we did already this sampling. We have now the first results from that what we did. And then we were looking at the existing models to see, we have these focus EFSA models, which pathways do they include? And to my surprise, I saw that in all these models, the particulate transport is not taken into consideration. That means the dust which makes your windows dirty in springtime, this is the dust which comes from the fields which are treated with a herbicide, and the particulate transport is a transport of the finest soil fractions. And this is the dust on your windows. And we can prove that the pesticides absorb on the finest soil fractions and the finest fractions of the dust as well, which are directly lung relevant. Effect on humans? Unknown. And furthermore, what we found out is that the erosion, the water erosion related transport, which in catchments which are prone to water erosion, may be more than 50%, or maybe contribute more than 50% to the off-site transport, are not considered. So the idea was, in earlier times, reduce the water solubility of the pesticides to keep them in the soils, because only the soluble transport is considered, and all the other off-site transport is not considered. So we were really curious what we will find out in our different study sites. What is the sprint approach as well, and what we did not yet do, we started with this year. We will test risks, long and short term, of mixtures, and we will take resilience as a new indicator to this. I think in the COVID pandemic, we all knew how important resilience is. Some people got very ill, others not at all. So this was the resilience of people against diseases. But this resilience is as well important for ecosystem health to prevent diseases, as well as for human and animal health. So we will as well try to make benchmarks, because, as you all know, we only have benchmarks or maximum residue levels for food and for water. For all the other ecosystem components, for human matrices, there is not any maximal residue level established. And what we as well will do, make scenarios for pesticide risk and use reduction following the farm-to-fork strategy. So what did we find? We find, here you only see the environmental results. I was asked to show you only the environmental part. Per field, in our 10 case study sites, 1 to 18 pesticides were applied per field. Dust, it is here air and dust, which we collected near conventional fields and as well near organic fields. And what you could see here, we found until 32 different pesticides in a period of 2 months in the growing season near the conventional fields, and 32 near the organic fields where no pesticide has been applied. So where does this air dust come from? We can see this spread all over, and it's not only focused on drift 200, 250 meters near the fields. The sediment, and here we talk to water bodies which are connected to either organic or conventional fields. We can see here that we find 8 and 23 different components. In the Water Framework Directive, we only look for the water, the content in water. But the animals in the water, the macrozooplankton, they are living in the sediments, and fish graze on it. So in the soils, what is the object of the application? In conventional farms, we found until 22 different pesticides during the growing season. In organic soils, 12. And here, interesting to see the maximum concentrations we found, and this was 23 and 13 milligram per kilogram. This is much more than available phosphate, which is needed for plant growth. And then in the water bodies, we found as well 36 to 40, more than 40 different components. So we are talking here about mixtures all over. And in the water bodies, where we have the maximum residue levels, we found 1 and 5 milligram per liter. And normally for water, it's a 0.1 or 0.5 milligram per liter, which is the limit. Now I ask you, what do you think what we found in people's blood? The results we just get last week, I only have them for the Dutch case study site. And it's as high as in water and even higher. We found concentration until 16 microgram per liter in human blood, and farmers had until 9 different mixtures. These are concentrations which are in the range of hormones in human blood. Effects are known. In human feces, we found until 50 microgram per kilogram excrements. Effect on gut microbiome, which is very important for the resilience of humans, unknown. Okay, then we were checking the PBDP database, which you all know, and we wanted to know, okay, what is known about the environmental risk assessment? And we were trying here to get the public available data. Vera did this work together with a colleague, and I show here, as the lady before presented for mammals, birds, fish, and so on, and then where no data on hazard were available, moderate or high risk. And we summed them up. And you can see here that between 68 to 100% of all these organisms, for all these organisms, the pesticides we have found were only either no data, moderate, or highly toxic. So I asked myself, if we are applying the precautionary principle in risk assessment, how is it possible that more than half of all pesticides which are on the market are moderate, high toxic, or I can't find any data? So I called a colleague from EFSA. I said, look, Vera, we are doing something wrong. We don't find this data. How is it possible? And the colleague told me, no, that is normal. We have the data, but it's not public available. You know this much better than I do, but that was the answer I got, and so we published it like this. And I give only to look about that, you all know that the indicators, the endpoints we are testing from these organism groups are very limited and only based on single pesticide tests. EFSA is developing now concepts for mixtures. But the question is, how will we go on these mixtures? I showed you how many mixtures we find in the different ecosystem components. And I wanted to show you as well our concept here on resilience. You can see here the ecosystem health as an example for soil health. In the root zone for the soils, for the plants, we have the soil microbiome. And we have the good ones, the bacteria and fungi, which enhance plant growth. We have the bad ones, which are the pathogens. And what happens if certain pesticides enter? The good ones are killed, the bad ones take over. And then the completely equilibrium on the soil and the soil health is gone. And farmers have to apply more and more and more plant protection products because the soil system is not working anymore. So what we did is, what we are going to do now in the Sprint project, based on the data we have collected in the field, we will look at the resilience, reproductivity, and diseases. And how we will select this, I focus here only on the ecotox tests. Our toxicologists do the same for the toxicology, human and animal toxicology. What we are going to do is, we have already identified the pesticides, as I told you, the residues. From the 11 different case study sites, we select per case study site 20 active substances or their metabolites, which are either the most applied or the most frequently detected, and which have the highest risk coefficient. We will use then standard soils, and this is as well very important. There is nearly no soil anymore without DDT derivatives. Most of the soils contain DDEs, they contain HCBs and others. The old ones, which were forbidden 50 years ago, but which have a half-life time of 50 years. So we take soils which exist, which have background values on the old pesticides, and then we will use a whole mixture approach and test the effects on the mixtures on EFSA organisms, here as an example for soil. And we test as well the single pesticides and mixtures on new Sprint indicators, which are native species, which are much more sensible to pesticide applications than EFSA organisms. And then we will extend them for until 150 days to see as well the effect on the F1 generation. So you can see here our Sprint indicators. And what we will do, and that is as well important, we will use concentrations, low-level concentrations, based on the observations we have made in the field, and we as well will take this time component into consideration, applying formulations as they are applied in the case study sites. And last but not least, in the Sprint project, we will develop a toolbox which is then be ready for use for European Commission in 2025, I think, where we will deliver these new ecotox and toxicological tests. We will deliver models where this component of wind and water erosion related transport is included. We will develop maps, European maps, where we will show the risk, the actual risk, and the actual use of pesticides, so that this is a base for the European Commission to see how they will be able to reduce pesticide risk and use. My take-home messages. To achieve the farm-to-fork strategy, Sprint will provide a global health approach based on field data, use and risk maps on European scale, scenarios, we have already published this, to achieve the farm-to-fork strategy 50% reduction goals. You can find this online available. And that is very important, transition to a modern agriculture, call it Agriculture 2030, on agroecological and precautionary concepts. We are flying to the moon, we are flying to the Mars. We can do it with modern technologies, establish modern agriculture in Europe. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Violette, for your very intense talk, a little bit longer than a pitch that we have foreseen, I must say, but it was full of data. And I think there are a lot of information that we will take up also in the discussion. I would like to present our next speaker. It's Professor Sandrine Charles from the University of Lyon. Sandrine leads the team Predictive Modeling in Ecotoxicology and focuses on the quantitative risk assessment, the development of mathematical and statistical models to link ecotoxicology with the impact in the field. And your talk will be on the new approach methodology called NAM and their usefulness in environmental risk assessment. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia, for this introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. The remote. Yes. Most scientists agree that pollution knows no borders. Pollutants are everywhere, in all compartments of the geosphere, at all levels of organization in the biosphere. Regarding pesticides, from their application point, they disseminate in the environment, thus impacting biodiversity, ecosystem services, but also human health. So there is a need, a crucial need, to decipher the risks due to pesticides. Thanks to Annette, we are now convinced that we need a change in paradigm in order to do better, to sustain a better practice. The concept of risk is based on both the identification of hazard and the characterization of exposure. Today, in a regulatory context, risks are considered across 4 tiers. Each tier relies on data that derive from a set of experimental studies. In moving from tier 1 to tier 4, we gain in ecological realism, moving from single species tests until approaches involving multiple species. Moreover, longer time scales and larger spatial scales are also considered throughout the process. Each tier is performed with dedicated models that are increasing in their complexity, but also in their data requirements. And the consequence of this is that some of these models can be difficult to use. This is exactly the reason that motivated us in 2013 to develop the Mosaic web platform in order to help risk assessors and risk managers to handle these models. Today, in a regulatory context with Mosaic, you can use several kinds of models. The classical dose-response models in order to estimate toxicity indices, such as, for example, LC50. You can also calculate bioaccumulation metrics using toxicokinetic models. And it is also possible to use toxicokinetic, toxicodynamic models to make the link between the time dimension of the exposure and the effects on survival over time. Benefiting from a Bayesian framework for inference, Mosaic provides all the results associated with the quantification of the uncertainty. This is where we stand today. So, what to do next? What can we still improve? A starting point is to consider, to do better, the internal organs within living organisms. When exposed to pesticides, organisms may accumulate the substance via different routes of exposure, such as drinking water, eating different kinds of food, or even some non-identified sources. And at the same time, what is accumulated is also eliminated, either by growth or directly excreted. To do better, it is also important to consider the metabolites of a parent compound, because these metabolites can also be considered as intake sources together with their elimination process. So, going to advanced models in order to perform environmental risk assessment means a change in paradigm, which is based today, as explained, on the one compound, one species principle. But we all know that organisms in the environment are exposed to several chemicals that can interact together. A chemical itself is a mixture of an active substance with adjuvants and emulsifiers. Pesticides are often combined in order to control different kinds of pests, and the agricultural practices can change from one field to the next. Moreover, it is important to have in mind that organisms are not only exposed to chemicals, but also to multiple environmental stressors, such as climate change, or pathogens, or habitat loss. So to go forward from the current risk assessment, it is finally important to consider the whole exposome of organisms together with an organ-based view for the development of new models. This means to move towards a systems-based approach. And this systems-based approach should also consider ecological interactions, such as, for example, trophic relationships or between species competition for food resources or habitat occupancy. And this complexity can still increase if we also consider space and time. So the change in paradigm to move towards a systems-based approach will require to sustain research, to develop more complex, yet realistic and efficient models, and for modelers to offer these models via user-friendly tools in order to hope a better acceptability and a wider use in risk assessment. It is also important to consider that all partners have to collaborate, especially under the umbrella of open science and fair data principles. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this comprehensive talk, and also on focusing on new approaches, for example, in the toxicodynamics of a multiple exposure in organisms. We have now a coffee break that is a little bit shortened compared to what we have planned. I'm sorry for that. You look a little bit panicking. We need to resume 3:45. So I hope you manage to get a coffee and be refreshed. If you can be here at 3:45, we will be happy. Thank you very much. I think we start with some additional talks, pitch talks, and then come to our moderated panel discussion. I would like now to introduce our third speaker in this pitch talks, which is Professor Chris Topping. He is professor at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. He will be online, and he gives a pre-recorded talk, but Chris is online and also follows this session. His talk would be on the simulation to support system-based ERA capability and possibilities. And Chris is professor for ecological modeling and leads the Social Ecological System Simulation Center. So I think we can see his presentation. Thank you.
Including the local context in their assessments, and these assessments are going to be broader, including socioeconomic aspects. I think that this will be dovetailed across agricultural and landscape policies, such that these policies work locally together, pulling in the same direction. So why do we need this? Well, we need this because the world is a complex place. And this complexity is something we ought to embrace, not try to factor away, because it's not just a feature or a difficulty to be overcome, but it's a driving force determining the system responses to, for example, pesticide use. But to deal with this, we need to move away from simple models and simple general approaches to approaches which can incorporate this complexity and incorporate the different interactions that are needed. Now, this sounds like a tall order, but science and technology have moved on very quickly over the last 30 years. And what I want to do now is just to give you a taste of what's possible and what could be possible in the future. So let's first start to talk about computing power. Now, this Sony PlayStation you have on the screen here is probably the fastest, most powerful computer most people have in their homes, this or an Xbox. Now, recently in Europe, there was a computing facility launched called LUMI. So LUMI is a high-performance computing facility. LUMI has a power of 550 petaflops, so this is how fast it is. Now, that means absolutely nothing to almost everybody. So in terms of Sony PlayStations, when you turn LUMI on, it's equivalent to turning on 300,000 Sony PlayStations at once. It's 20 million times more powerful than the Cray C90, which was the fastest computer when Directive 91414 was first implemented. These kind of facilities are available for industry, the Commission, and researchers across Europe. And we have, in fact, oceans of computing power. So one thing that's really important to underline here is that we shouldn't be afraid of computing power. It's not the limiting factor. Based on all this new computing power, there's also a new tool in our toolbox called machine learning. So it's not smartphones, but artificial intelligence. And there are many ways which this can help. One being development of the simulation itself. For example, finding out what patterns exist in the real world, which we might want to incorporate into the simulation. They can be used for calibration and sensitivity analysis, because they can cope with the billions of combinations of all these hundreds of parameters we need, which basically no other method can. And they can be used to create emulators, which are small programs which behave very much like the big simulation, but only take a fraction of the computing power. Not all the outlooks are quite as rosy as the technology one, though. These simulations are very data hungry. But this is a place where the Commission could actually be of tremendous help to us, because the biggest single blocker to developing the simulations is accessibility of this data. A lot of the times the data is available, we just can't get it. So particularly data that's collated under the Common Agricultural Policy to support subsidies, or under the Sustainability Directive, which is basically the data on pesticide use. If this data could be collated and made available to us, it would be a huge step. Of course, there are other data gaps too, including toxicology, and we know that there's a lot of work in Europe now ongoing to try to fill these data gaps. So I'm less worried about those. And with those two main exceptions, we have all the data that we need to drive these simulations already. So the question is more, what should the simulation look like once we actually have it? Some of the characteristics of the simulations which we need to support this new way of thinking are that they're holistic, that they combine mechanisms together in a sensible and seamless way, just like this logo where everything is connected. And we can use them to predict the effects of using different management and changing conditions. They need to use multimodal data, so they need the ability to pull in economic data, geographic data, toxicology, ecological data. And they need to be very flexible with respect to different scales, so both spatial and temporal. Now, this seems like a tall order, but actually we've come a long way already towards achieving this. So just a little taster of what's possible already now. What you see here are some representations of landscapes developed using the Animal Landscape and Man Simulation System, ALMAS. Now, ALMAS can generate these landscapes for currently 12 European countries. And once they're generated, they simulate an area of land, perhaps 10 by 10 kilometers up to 40 by 40 kilometers at a very, very great detail. So we're talking about simulations of 1 meter resolution, where we model the management of all the fields individually, the crop growth, vegetation growth, and we include the farmer. And in fact, we also include the economy of that farm. When we put all this together, that creates a kind of a virtual reality into which we can put our entities of interest. So this might be ladybirds, and we can have very many of these. So a single run might include 50 million interacting ladybirds, and it still runs on a normal PC. Now, combine this information with what I told you about the high performance computing, and you can see that we're no longer restricted to just 6 focus scenarios across Europe. What we could do here is we can generate pretty much on the fly any area of landscape, combine this together with our different focal entities, and create a risk assessment, including the local context. But I don't think it's going to stop here. This is what we can already do. In the future, I think we're going to actually include a lot more. So we're going to include environmental accounting in terms of carbon, nitrogen, and energy flows in order to be able to really link the outputs of these simulations to multiple policies. So now I think especially risk assessors will be going, oh no, these complex models, it's going to create an incredibly complex risk assessment. But it's important to realize that this need not be the case. Just like driving a car, you don't need to know how the internal combustion engine works to be a good driver. And it should be the same with these tools that we create for simulation. Simulations themselves may be very complex, but as long as they do what they're supposed to do and are tested and are trusted, then you can use them without being able to understand the real details of the inner workings. In fact, I think in the future, risk assessors won't even use the simulation themselves, because this is too big and heavy a tool to run. This is where those emulators come in that I mentioned earlier. So the emulators mean that we can remove the big heavy simulations and replace them with small computer programs that run on a smartphone. So the future of risk assessment, a risk assessor should be able to take their smartphone, dial up any area in Europe and use those to make assessments for a range of focal entities, including the local context. They'll be able to include mitigation factors and the effect of those on those entities, and will also include the socioeconomic feedbacks in both ways. This means that we're really going to achieve this aim of allowing policies to pull together, because we'll be simulating the same areas of the countryside. And for example, whether a farmer has carried out these mitigation measures, perhaps this would be possible to police under the Common Agricultural Policy as part of the subsidies framework. But I think all of this is possible. It's not science and technology that are limiting. The challenge is actually how to implement this transition. Thank you for your attention. And my keywords are system simulation and context.
So thank you very much, Chris. You're listening to our session. Thank you for your talk and for showing us the possibilities of simulation in environmental risk assessment of pesticides. I would like to introduce and to call on stage our next speaker. And our last pitch talk is Stefanie Bopp from the European Commission Joint Research Center in Ispra in Italy. And Stefanie is a scientific project leader and is related to all activities related to the combined exposure of chemicals, especially in the information platform for chemical monitoring, which is IPCHEM. And you will give a talk on the tools and monitoring data that are available to assess the impact of multiple pesticides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. Here we are. So we heard many times this morning, or this afternoon, that our current environmental risk assessment is based mainly on single pesticides and their specific uses. And if we look at the way the landscape looks today and how pesticides are used, and consider also that organisms will migrate and move around, we can see that sequential exposures, repeated exposures, and combined exposures are very likely. And with this in mind, we'll talk now about the tools and monitoring and surveillance data and how they can help us to assess the impact of multiple pesticides. And I put together these ideas with input from my colleagues Antonio Franco and Alberto Pistocchi. So in our usual prospective environmental risk assessment, we usually use modeling to predict concentrations in the environment, and therefore we need some assumptions to build our models, and we can check if these hold true and if they need refinement by comparing them to monitoring data to look at the exposures we really find in the environment. And monitoring can also feed back if we find problems. It can feed back into the prospect or into the environmental risk assessment. And modeling can also feed back into the monitoring by helping to tailor the the monitoring programs. So, but for all of that, we need the data. And that's why I want to bring to you your attention the information platform for chemical monitoring, IPCHEM, that's run by the European Commission. And that offers a current state of chemicals and various media, so not only the environment, but also human biomonitoring, concentrations in indoor air and in food and feed. And we do that in collaboration with the agencies, with the Environment Agency, EFSA, and ECHA. And we have currently more than 490 million concentration measurements covering more than 3,000 substances. So this is important because we know that we do a lot of monitoring. Monitoring requires a big effort, it's a big investment, and we cannot just have the data somewhere hidden, so we should really share them to make best use and reuse of the data. But even if we have a lot of data, we still have some limitations in the coverage. So for example, for pesticides in environmental media, we mainly have data in water and not in, for example, soil or air. We have only a small percentage of active substances currently authorized are covered if we consider that we should have data for a wider range of member states and areas. So we have a few member states from which we have data where we have really a lot of active substances covered, but for the whole of Europe, the number is overall limited at the moment. But we have a good example where when we look at data in soil, there is new data coming up, the Lucas Soil Survey, which stands for Land Use and Coverage Area Frame Survey. So it's a program that runs in 3 to 4 year cycles and generates data for soil samples across Europe. And in the last cycle of 2018, there was an analysis of more than 100 pesticides included, and which provides nice opportunities also in about 880 locations. They also analyzed the samples for soil microbial biodiversity using DNA analysis and metabarcoding techniques. So this gives us the opportunity to look at, first of all, pesticide risks in these locations from pesticides, to combine that with other variables that are collected, like climatic conditions, soil properties, land cover, and so on. And then, in a second step, to look at associations with, for example, direct impacts on soil microbial biodiversity. And this is ongoing work, so unfortunately I cannot present the last part, which is the relation to the soil biodiversity, but I can show you some preliminary results provided by my colleague Antonio Franco, who looked at the sum of toxic units for these soil locations. So for the pesticides detected in these soil samples for these 1,500 locations, he divided the concentrations by the no observed effect concentrations for soil organisms, and then summed up these toxic units for all the pesticides detected in a certain location, and then ranked the locations according to the sum of toxic units. And this is just to illustrate how the data can help us, how we can build, for example, risk indicators. We can look at what are substances that are frequently detected as drivers of risk. We can look at trends and spot locations that are of concern, and once repeated these measurements in time in the different cycles, we can also look at time trends. But as I said before, our monitoring data are still limited, and we need a complementary use of modeling and monitoring. And here I want to show you an example of my colleague Alberto Pistocchi and his team, where they used pesticide use data and modeled concentrations in river and soil, and they did that for virtually all active substances currently approved. So the nice thing here is that they can really cover all the active substances, while in monitoring we are often limited to a low number of substances. So what they did then, based on these predicted concentrations in soil and rivers, they compared it to the toxicity and also calculated like a sum of toxic units and put that on. We can see that on a map. So this has been compared to monitoring data for those regions where we have good monitoring data, and they found a good match for some active substances. Overall, there was a tendency to underestimate, but it's a very useful tool that helps us not to look at the risk driver or a specific active substance for an accurate prediction, but to look at the whole space of active substances and to show us what is the risk range using all these substances and the sum of them in terms of toxic units. And it also helps us to run, for example, different scenarios, like what happens if the use is changed and so on. So with this, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what can be done with monitoring data in this complementary use with modeling. And I want to conclude with saying that we see that the monitoring programs, they still need to evolve. We need to cover more substances, and it's difficult to capture the particular uses and the pulsed exposure due to pesticide use, but they can still be very helpful to look at real-world exposure patterns that help fine-tuning the assumptions that we use for building our models. They can directly feed back into the risk assessment, and they can also help us to develop risk indicators, to look at the progress we are making in protecting our environmental organisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your talk. I think the data will be extremely helpful for risk assessment and also risk management to understand which is the environment we put our pesticide to, and to link also the prospective and the retrospective risk assessment. Now we are coming to a third part of our session, which is a moderated panel debate. The moderated panel debate will be on the possible way forward, how to implement the transition, if possible, and the regulatory uptake of a system-based approach in the current system, or also within future developments. I am really happy to introduce our moderator, which is Mr. Frédéric Simon. And Frédéric is here. Thank you very much. Frédéric is a journalist by training. He is editor at Active, the leading online media that is specialized in European affairs. He focused in works, I must say, on a wide range of topics. EU policies are the focus, and from the economics to agriculture and also to climatic legislation. We need now for the panel discussion to have some changes here in the setting of the chairs. And Frédéric, I wish you a very interesting and stimulating panel discussion. Thank you very much.
So we'll get the panel debate started in a minute, but we need to rearrange the chairs. So bear with us. It will be just a minute. No, it's coming up. I'm fine. Right, so sorry for that brief interruption. And welcome again to this year's One Conference on Health, Environment and Society, organized by EFSA and other European agencies in charge of health, chemicals, research and the environment. So as Sylvia said, I'm Frédéric Simon. I'm the Energy and Environment Editor of Euractiv. We're an online media specialized in European affairs, and I will be your host for this panel discussion called Environmental Risk Assessment of Pesticides, Transitioning to a System-Based Approach. What you can see here on the screen is the word cloud that the previous speakers have generated. Each one of them suggested 2 words, and so these are the words that they consider to be the most important. We'll be asking the panelists to react to this. Now, as you heard in the previous session, there's a growing disconnect, or at least a growing perceived disconnect, between the current environmental risk assessment of pesticides and the real-life observations when it comes to their impact on human health and the environment. And we also heard several ways in which this disconnect could be potentially bridged in the future, for example, by using data, new technologies, and wider impact assessments to assess the exposure to multitudes of pesticides or chemical substances. Now, in the coming panel debate, we will focus our attention on what can be done about this. Many voices are indeed now calling for a system-based approach to the risk assessment of pesticides. So, is a new approach indeed necessary, What benefits could it bring, and what are the challenges also when it comes to implementing it? To discuss this topic today, I have the pleasure of inviting now on stage our panelists, Annette Aldrich from the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland, who made one of the presentations before. Please, you can get on stage. And Alex from Corteva Agri-Sciences, representing the industry. Martin Dermine from the Pesticide Action Network, representing civil society. Martin Housik, he's a Slovak MEP from the Renew Europe group in the European Parliament, just joining us fresh from a voting session in the Parliament on the emissions trading scheme. I won't be asking questions about this, don't worry. And Karin Nienstedt, who works in the unit in charge of pesticides and biocides at the European Commission's Directorate for Health and Food Safety. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us today. Now, we have just under 1 hour to explore this debate about the environmental risk assessment of pesticides. This will be an interactive session, so you will have the opportunity to ask questions directly to the panelists or to make comments directly to them. For that, you can use the event app, which has been introduced before, and you can put your comments directly there. But now, before we dive into the conversation, let's first take a look at this word cloud that came out from the previous sessions. So these are the words and expressions that the panelists, the speakers, thought were the most important to them. I think you briefly saw the word cloud behind us. Maybe we can get it projected again behind us and in the screen in front of us, because I would like to ask the panelists to react to this word cloud. If you can briefly show it up again. Okay, I see this is maybe not happening, maybe by memory? No, okay, that is asking too much. Oh, magic. Great. So let's start with you, Annette Aldrich. Is there anything in this word cloud, I mean, you contributed to it yourself. Are there any words or expressions you think are essential and could be missing from this?
It's a challenge. It does seem to be very repetitive, no? Because I was just thinking there's been like 2 keywords per presenter, so there's a lot of words on that screen. If something is missing is the question.
Something is missing, or something maybe you think shouldn't be there at all? I don't see the precautionary approach, for example, among them. I guess it's kind of assumed that precautionary approach is driving most of the conversation, as you actually said in your own presentation, I think. But I mean, it's okay. You can maybe you think this is a fair reflection of the state of the debate.
I thought that all the debates were really creating a very, very nice picture of the issues and the points that we have to discuss.
Okay.
So those keywords are related to those discussions and the presentations that we heard. So yes, that does give a very nice overview and summary.
Okay, very good. Maybe Anne Alex, then if you have comments to make about this word cloud, do you think there's maybe something missing in there or words which shouldn't be there at all?
Well, I think we find what has been said before, so holistic is clearly there. I am assuming that by context we mean realism. Place the risk assessment into context means more realism in a risk assessment that would be closer to the field, and we've seen the call for that in the previous presentation. So I believe we've pretty.
Okay, so you're broadly in accordance with it. Martin Dermine, maybe comments from your side?
Yes, I would say what I missed a little bit this afternoon in the presentations is the fact that it needs to be results-oriented. It's still very theoretical. I missed the link to the risk managers, because even if risk assessors do a good job, very often risk managers do not follow to protect the environment or human health. And there is something I think in the reflection that should be integrated much more.
Okay, thank you. Martin Horsig, comment?
Well, I missed the whole debate in the afternoon. Sorry for that. But have to vote, kind of keep out of the job. No, but looking at and trying to kind of feel the word cloud, yet the precautionary principle, but also things like life and biodiversity. Because why are we doing all of this? We're doing these things to be able to essentially sustain life on this planet. It's a very basic thing, but that's right now what is happening. So kind of, it's also about what is the end game for, and that's, I think, we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, a lot of it indeed was a bit assumed, but it's maybe better to make it explicit. And so to conclude, Karin Instedt, your views about this word cloud?
Yeah, what I am missing a little bit, and I agree that the objective is missing a bit. It was in the debate before you missed. I mean, that was clear, but it's not in the word cloud. What I am missing a little bit is how this would be transposed in, let's say, a regulatory system, and what kind of environmental risk assessment is meant concretely, because you have prospective risk assessment, retrospective risk assessment, you have a risk assessment at EU level, you have risk assessment at member state level, you have even probably a risk assessment at farm level when the farmer chooses which is the most appropriate product or crop management tool. So there are a lot of ideas, but how to make this happen really, and at which level, I mean, that's not in the word cloud.
Okay, thanks for that. It's a good way to set the scene. And now to go straight into the conversation and getting to the topic of today's debate about the need for a more systemic approach to the environmental risk assessment of pesticides. So do you believe on this panel that a paradigm shift is indeed needed when it comes to the environmental risk assessment of pesticides? And if so, how do you see a transition to such a system happening? And we can start with you again, Annette Aldrich.
I guess the short answer is yes. After the presentation that I've given, I do see a need for a paradigm shift. That was the title of my presentation. So the question I will focus more on is on the transition, and I think that has also been pointed out. It's not very concrete yet. Maybe, and I think we even have a language problem because we talk about systems-based, we talk about integrate, holistic. You can also see that on the keywords. So I think it's very important to clarify the language that we're using, define a bit more what we're actually talking about, make it more concrete. And this discussion needs to lead to an engagement and to creating a partnership. So I think that is a very, very first discussion, the first point that we have to address. Find a common language, create this partnership, and have a common goal in mind, sort of to work towards it. And I think that is also very important from the session that we're having today, and also thinking about what we listened to this morning, is this, it's all very similar. You know, this morning I was listening to sustainable assessment, and I was thinking, well, it's very similar the way they're talking, but we've got our little silos. And I think that's the message from this conference as well, to break out of the silos, to learn from each other, and to enable this transition on a whole range of aspects, because we're all facing with huge challenges. So, but while we're working towards this long aim, I think we need to also focus on short-term impacts what can have. The goal is to reduce the risk, and I think there's more ways to achieve this than just improving the risk assessment. We can already improve compensation areas, risk mitigation measures, etc. So there's a lot of things we can do in the short term, once we've realized that we have a common goal and we have this commitment from everybody. And then we have long-term perspectives, which is also the PARC project, which is really working on concrete research projects, what need to be developed in the future.
Okay, so need for a common goal, maybe that indeed is where we should be starting. And Alex, your views about the need for a paradigm shift. Do you broadly agree that something like this is necessary? And if so, how could we transition to such a system?
Well, I think yes, and I think we're kind of nearly already in it through the orientations we're seeing with the current policy changes. And if I may correct my previous answer, sustainability, maybe it's my side, but maybe it should be there as well, because it's a quite important word, particularly today. So yes, need for a change, absolutely, and it's representing the industry here. I think it's in our interest that a risk assessment is protective, yeah, and that it meets the highest standard in protection of the human health and the environment. It is not in our interest that such a risk assessment isn't protective. So, and in this respect, and I was mentioning sustainability today, because of this, we're seeing the publication of a draft regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides that is going to really put into legislation the targets that we've seen for the farm to fork, of pesticide use reduction, of pesticide risk reduction. So I do believe that this debate we are having for the need for a change in the risk assessment is also part of this, in the way that practices and the agriculture is already evolving in that direction at a European level, but also at the field level. We are seeing already practices and farmers changing the way they use pesticides, and it needs to be reflected in this system-based approach, or whatever approach we go for in the future.
And we'll have a conversation later on about how this can be translated into policy, but we'll stay just on that question now, on whether a system-based approach is indeed necessary. Martin Dermine,
Yes.
Your views about this?
I'm sorry, I'm a bit more nuanced on the approach for several reasons. First, I don't think we have to completely change the system. This approach needs to be complementary to the current risk assessment. The current risk assessment allows to capture the toxicity of pesticides on a series of animals or environmental compartments, and also human health. And we also need to improve it to make it stricter. We saw it with honeybees and neonicotinoids. I disagree, Annette, in your presentation you mentioned we could broaden it to amphibians, to bats, but I do think we need to test more species because scientific evidence shows that specifically these species are extremely sensitive to pesticides in small quantities. So it's important to improve what we have already now, but whatever we do in terms of classic risk assessment, it will not be perfect because we cannot take into account all the situations. So that's why it's important to also broaden it with a system risk assessment, a more systemic approach that would help us correct the weaknesses of the current system. But it should not be a complete shift. It should not replace it. It should be complementary and help with the decision making.
So I think the current system has already many benefits, if I understand well, in your view.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Martin Hosik, your views about the need for a system-based approach to the risk assessment of pesticides. Do you agree this is necessary?
Well, we need to change the way we deal with this, but I think yes, system approach is one step, and it's definitely something we should look deeper in. But I think we need to do things before that, and also during the transition. One thing is, we have a waste hierarchy. You know, we have a waste hierarchy when we say the landfilling is the worst option. And we try to do everything to minimize the landfilling. We're not really implementing it properly, but we have a hierarchy. We have an energy hierarchy where we know that the energy efficiency should go first. And I think we need to have, and that's one of the expectations for the sustainable use, is we need to have very clear plant protection hierarchy. We actually, if we will be able to protect the plants without using synthetic pesticides, then from precaution principle, we should not even resort to that. There is then less to assess. And then when we end up, okay, there are areas where we cannot deploy integrated pest management, we don't have other methods, we have to use them, then there is a sense to do a proper assessment. And I think, yes, looking at the systems will need, will need to happen, because at the moment we are missing lots of the bits, but it should not stop us from acting. So on one side, what we see is when we look at neonics, not only the number of emergency authorizations, but a problem with the fact that, yes, part of it is on the seeds. And we all talk about honeybees, and I'm fighting for the honeybees. I'm fighting for the bumblebees. But the solitary bees, they live in the ground. When we coat the seeds with neonics, thinking, well, we're not spraying, bees are safe. Actually, then the neonics end up in the ground killing the solitary bees. And this is not properly captured in the whole assessment. So yes, we need more broad approach. But
right,
second,
and you think precautionary should come first?
Of course,
yeah.
Of course. And second, and that's also very important, is the transition. Because what we're facing now, and I'm feeling sometimes in the parliament like, MEP the objector, because we see repeated authorization extensions based on simply member states not delivering the assessment, So if I would be having a car that I know the brakes are falling and it keeps on killing people, but member state in charge of assessing if this is really true and doing proper systemic tests on it is not delivering those tests, would we be able to sell these cars? Well, because this is what is happening with some of the hazardous pesticides.
And this is where the precautionary approach should apply then.
It's precaution, but we know that even it's clear that the data will and the assessment will end up in a certain way. It just wasn't officially concluded. Mm-hmm. We don't have to assess everything and spend the resources of the authorities as well as the industry when we know already from the available data, that the brakes are faulty. I don't need to assess whether the blinkers are working.
So this is something, I believe, which exists in another regulation. I'm not sure it applies here, but it's the no data, no market, which applies in REACH. But
yeah.
Okay, Karin Ninstedt, your views from the point of view of the European Commission, which made a big proposal actually today on pesticides. So is a new system-wide approach desirable from the Commission's point of view?
Before I come to that, I would just like to clarify that we have actually a hierarchy for plant protection products or crop protection. We have IPM, which was in the Sustainable Use Directive and is actually mandatory also under Regulation 1107 to farmers, and which now with the new proposal for the Sustainable Use Regulation will be enforced.
That's the thing. Member states ignored it.
Well, I don't know if they ignore it, but let's not discuss that. We have another hierarchy, and that's the low-risk active substances and the candidate for substitutions. For candidate for substitutions, they are allowed for, approved for a shorter period of time, and member states should do a comparative risk assessment before they authorize products. So there is a sort of hierarchy. And then, of course, you have the labeling, which is on the products for the farmers, which in a way is also a hierarchy which is provided to the end user. And as regards the delays, I fully agree. I mean, these delays are also a stomachache for us. But just to mention that many of the delays are also due to the fact at the moment that we are analyzing the endocrine disruptor criteria, and this needs time. We have applied the new criteria retroactively, so we need to give time to the applicants to provide the data to look at this. And that's part of the reason of the delays which are coming to your desk. So back to the question, is a paradigm shift needed or not? I believe that the current legislation has everything in place to accommodate a better implementation. So yes, in some cases, a systemic view is a bit missing. We also see that for low-risk products, for microorganisms, for instance, in the risk assessments. So in this case, we have now proposed for acts to put more ecology and more biology into the risk assessment so that it's more systemic, more looking at the biology, what is actually happening with the microorganisms. So yes, a systemic view is important, any new method development is welcome, is needed. But for instance, monitoring data should actually be provided. Comparative risk assessment, I already mentioned it, is also part of, let's say, the regulatory scheme. So yes, I mean, we need to implement it better. And there is space for it in the current system.
Partly desirable, but implementation first and foremost, if I can summarize what you said.
I am saying no real need to change the regulatory system because we can accommodate for these new methodologies which are coming up.
In the current system.
In the current system.
Okay, maybe I'll stay with you for the next question then, which is looking at policy now and how a potentially more system-based approach to the risk assessment of pesticides can be actually put in practice. So there was a proposal coming out of the European Commission today. I'm not sure it actually covers this, but maybe it does in some ways, and you can update us on this. But what is, in your view, the challenges in translating this now into policy and regulation? Challenges, but also opportunities.
Well, it's difficult to answer because this system approach, I would need to have a bit more concrete data, what is exactly meant with, which are the methods concretely. We had some presentations this afternoon. Some were more concrete than others. But in general, they were still very abstract. So, of course, if you want to translate new technological developments in regulatory science, you need to have you need to have clarity about the methods and how you can implement it.
Is there a risk, I understand, that we can make that the system becomes too complex and is bogged down in detail?
The system may become complex for very complex situations, but part of the advantages of the system we have with the tiered system is that actually if you have a tiered system, you can screen out low-risk products very early. So that means that it will not be very complex for all the cases. You may have cases which are, let's say, less complex, which you can stop at the first or second tier, and then you have others which, yes, I mean, if you want a systemic approach, it may become very, very complex, yeah.
Right, so the current system actually probably allows for a faster approval of some innovative plant protection products than if you adopt a very system-wide approach which makes the whole assessment a bit more complex. I mean, this is a trade-off, right?
It's yeah. I am not sure the current system, I mean, compared to the future and the systemic approach maybe, but at the moment, I mean, not always, no.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Annette, Aldrich, your views about how a more system-based approach to the environmental risk assessment of pesticides, how this can be translated into policy and regulation. So what are your thoughts about that? What are the challenges and the opportunities?
I think I also have to agree with Karin that I don't think that the regulation needs to be changed because there's a lot of information already in there and we're maybe actually falling a bit short of the regulation at the moment because it does say that we're supposed to consider agricultural and environmental conditions. We're supposed to consider indirect effects on the food web. So there's a lot more in it than we're actually using at the moment. So I don't really think that we need to change the regulation. Actually, there's one thing in the uniform principle which surprised me a little bit, but it does even say that the same usage of the same product in one area should be considered. So we have the systems-based approach already in the uniform principles. We don't need to change the regulation. What I actually find a little bit more hindering in the regulation, that it's very specific at times. So for instance, the assessment factors of 110, they're really put down in the uniform principles. And I think that nearly hinders because it's too scientific for such a broad range, high-level regulation. And if you want to move forward to a systems-based approach and give more flexibility, work more together with the risk managers to have more local management options to look more at a national scale, like the example I made with a national impact, even though you're doing a product-specific impact, look at what the impact on biodiversity is on a national scale, and maybe then compensation areas are very useful. So these assessment factors and uniform principle are very little bit limiting sometimes, and you want to break out of it, and you want to have more of a discussion. And these figures are like black and white, and I think we need to get away from this black and white, more into a discussion. And that is also the question about where does a system start and end. I think some people think about a system and only think about the landscape. For me, a system goes more into a dialogue.
So where can this dialogue actually take place then, in your view?
I would love to know who is present here. I mean, we had this discussion before. Are we going to have a communication with the society? Are they listening today? I mean, this was a free event. I'd love to know who is participating. Did we manage to reach out to society? Did EFSA manage to reach out to society and have that discussion with the society, with the consumer, with the farmer? Are the farmers listening? Because they are really not included in the system at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, maybe thoughts from your side about, do you believe there's a need to change regulations which are currently in place to implement a more system-wide approach? Or do you believe, like Annette, that maybe the current rules are just fine, they just need to be approached differently and put in practice differently, maybe at the member state level?
Well, indeed, I pretty much agree with that. With Annette, we've got in the regulation today, the way the decision making is being made, there are quite a number of clauses regarding biodiversity, regarding all of the protection objectives of the regulation. Now, I would give you an answer that is, it depends on what the contour of that system-based approach are at the end of the day and what would be included in this system-based approach. If indeed the objective is to englobe multiple exposures, multiple stresses in the system and understand what are the effects of multiple stresses on biodiversity and link it back to the practice, how they evolve, to the sustainable use regulation, the application machinery that is going to be in place for precision applications in the future. For application technology, I mean, we've got the sustainable use regulation that should be in place in the future. I would ask, how about other stresses? What are we going to do about the climate change? We're already acting, obviously, and taking a lot of policy measures, but is that going to trigger additional policy instruments in order to also acknowledge these? I'm imagining, looking forward, that a system-based approach should be applicable to whatever type of product that is going to be brought on the market, including innovative products, including alternatives to pesticides. I mean, for a system to be reliable and actually serve life and the environment in the future, it should also englobe other stresses, other techniques, other practices.
And Alex, maybe a follow-up question, because assuming a more system-wide approach is agreed and goes forward, that, I imagine, would increase the chances that some substances will be prohibited or restricted. Is that something that you see as an issue, potentially, from your point of view as a chemical company?
Obviously, yes. I mean, if the system concludes that, or puts the bar at a different level, there will be fewer substances being approved at EU level. And then this is a society decision, this is a member state decision, this is not me to say, if it's something we want or not. From the moment it's fair. And this is where we would like the system, whatever it looks like in the future, allows to make fair decisions on active substances that are on the market today already and will be renewed, re-evaluated in the context of the current regulatory process, but also of any new products. So from the moment the system is fair and doesn't make unfair decisions on the industry and on, obviously, the users of those products, they don't use that for aesthetical reasons, then we live with the decision.
Right, so there's a bit more risk from your audience, from the point of view of your industry, obviously. But in terms of the opportunities, could a more system-based approach also stimulate innovation, maybe, in the sector, you coming up then with more innovative products.
Definitely, I think, and this innovation is already being stimulated with the sustainable use regulation in mind and the biodiversity strategy in mind. We are seeing more biopesticides coming and being developed, but we are also seeing an absolute bloom of new technologies to allow to more precisely use products where they should be applied, and through the use of sensors, through the use of either for application, to drive application, or to do scouting before a treatment to be able to spot weeds or pests where they are. So I think that technology is there, blooming around. We are really entering the era of digital applications and digital agriculture. So yes, definitely that will trigger more innovation. And but this should be reflected in a new risk assessment. If there is a shift, it should be reflected in such a system-based approach for the system to be fair.
Okay, so I see openness to that at least. Martin Dermine, from your point of view, how a system-based approach can be translated into policy. Do you believe a change in the current regulations are necessary?
From our experience with risk assessment and risk management is that the more complex it is, the easier it is for ministries of agriculture to not protect the environment and keep favoring the conventional way of farming. So clearly, if this generates a system that is more complex and that dilutes the message, and in the end you say, oh, it's maybe because of climate change, it's maybe because of this or that active substance, then I think it won't meet its target.
So you see more of a challenge rather than an opportunity there?
Clearly we see a challenge because risk managers, they need a clear yes or no answer to make a decision.
Yeah.
Also for them to be legally protected from legal challenges by the industry when an active substance is banned. So I think it can help. It can also help after the approval process, if one realizes that in the end, in the environment, you find much more active substance than, pesticides than what you had planned according to the models and so on. But definitely it should remain something simple and easy to use by risk managers and easy to understand for the civil society.
Okay. Martin Hoysik, your views about the challenges and opportunities of translating this into regulation, a more system-based approach to the evaluation of pesticides.
Now, one area where I see particular opportunity is addressing the challenge that we have now, that the whole assessment system has been built for chemicals and not for assessing using a bacteria as a plant protection. So this is where looking at the system, I think it opens up more for assessment of non-synthetic chemical alternatives to be used in plant protection. I think this is a potential positive step forward. I see the risk in kind of getting it so complicated that it will not be only challenging to kind of do any civil society oversight, but it might be also way more challenging for SMEs or smaller innovative companies to utilize it, including the cost factor. So this is something where we have to be sensitive. At the same time, I think what we should keep an eye on, and that refers to the current issue, is, let's say, I understand when you mentioned the assessment of endocrine disruptors as being one of the reasons. Yes, but this is when we say now, okay, we will have to start using the systemic approach assessment, so it's going to take a few more years. But we know that the car has brakes broken, and why do I need to go assessing the blinkers and whether the whole thing fits into the environment when I know the brakes are broken? So we should be able to do a cutoff when we know that certain intrinsic properties simply meet the criteria, that this is not going to market. We don't have to wait for the things. And I think this is one of the key things that will help to also speed up the process.
Karin Instedt, you wanted to react to
I
this?
just wanted to react that we have regulatory measures to take action without waiting, let's say, the renewal coming, let's say, to a decision. So that's, for instance, Article 21 in the regulation, which you can trigger if there are concerns. And we have cases like that. Actually, some of the neonics were Article 21 cases, which we have taken action. So, and we are using it more and more also. If there is a concern, we discuss with member states, we may send a mandate to EFSA to look at the information on these new concerns, and then we take action. So, yes, I mean, in a way, it's systemic also, because you look at the evidence which is coming from scientific literature or from monitoring data, concerns which have been, let's say, increasing over the years, and then you take action. So it's already a possibility in the regulation.
But given the number of objections that we feel based on exactly that we know that the cutoff limit will be happening, it's sadly still way too much.
Okay, Martin Hoesig, I'll stay with you for the next question, because this is really about politics now. Again, assuming we go for a more system-wide approach to the evaluation of pesticides, this is something that maybe will lead to fewer substances being available on the market, maybe increased cost for farmers. These are all the risks that could come with such a new approach. How do you think politicians such as yourself could sell this to the citizens, to their constituents, to farmers?
What you just said is, I translate it in a different language. Dealing with climate change is going to bring costs, and I think this is something which will result in fewer possibilities for the businesses and options for the consumers. How are you going to sell fighting climate change? Doesn't it sound somehow crazy to even think this way? We have a serious biodiversity problem. We are, Commission said it today, it's the 6th mass extinction. And yet we're not even properly implementing the hierarchy. This is where we should start. This is not about having fewer options for plant protection. More than 90% of the vegetable greenhouses in Europe, as a type of agriculture, the horticulture in Europe, are using integrated pest management. It's switched from the conventional pest management using pesticides to integrated pest management. The change started without even regulation because of the consumer pressure. And the result is, I don't know about you, but I actually see not just more volume, but more variety of tomatoes on the shelves of the supermarkets in the winter. Okay, now, so if I would start this whole thing with it's going to be a problem, let's look at it from a perspective of this is a solution to the problem. We have a problem is our overuse of pesticides, the fact that we have a collapse of pollinators, we have collapse of insects, and if we don't address it, then honestly, I don't know, pesticides will not do the pollination for us.
Okay, so that's a better environment, obviously, increased choice potentially for consumers as well. Annette Aldrich, your view about how politicians, or maybe even scientists like you, can sell this to the people, to the citizens?
Well, I do live in Switzerland, and last year we had 2 initiatives to ban pesticides. So there was a huge debate, a huge discussion going on, and that really involved society, it involved the farmers. There were a lot of concerns and fears expressed in that discussion. I think that was very fruitful, but the fear was so dominant from the farmers because they were so afraid the pesticides are going to be completely banned and they don't have a choice anymore. It was like taking the tools away from the farmers. They had nothing else to select anymore to choose. So both initiatives failed, they were rejected, but 40% of the people voted for it. So that really expresses the huge concern and also the demand to understand it better. So I thought it was a very, very interesting, but unfortunately the political pressure is so hard with this initiative. It's like either you say yes or no. You can't find sort of a compromise in these initiatives. That was very unfortunate. So I think the selling point, when we talk about paradigm shift, do we need it, yes or no? For me, a paradigm shift can also trigger a discussion. Mm-hmm. And I think that is why we need a paradigm shift, because we need to broaden the system, we need to integrate more people, the farmers. when we had these initiatives going on in Switzerland, it was very challenging for the farmers because they were suddenly the bad ones. And they were just doing what they were told to do. There was a regulation that said this system, this product is safe, you may use it. And other people are saying, no, it's not. So there's a very confusing message in there.
It's like you said, engagement and dialogue and also education maybe
Yes, exactly.
with the farmers, which comes at a cost usually. And Alex, are your views about the politics of this and selling to the citizens a more system-wide approach to the evaluation of pesticides?
Well, I think there are probably people better place than me to respond to this, but nevertheless, I think there is a concern, as you rightly mentioned, from the society regarding the environmental pollution and all the presentations we've seen and the discussions we had earlier today. I mean, this is not to be denied and it's got to be addressed. But now when we look at the agricultural system, and to get back to some of the discussions we had yesterday on the way we produce agriculture and sustainable agriculture as such sustainable systems, it's beyond pesticide use. It's how are we going to produce locally? How are we going to reduce the carbon footprint in producing more locally? And indeed, probably the fact that we are failing at getting this evolution fast enough in the mind of people and of users is that what have they got? They don't probably have a clear vision of what they are facing. I'm not necessarily having a clear vision of what we're facing either. So I think we need to think indeed system production, local, what traits, what crops. Have we got the crops to do that? Can we actually do that? In what sort of system? And then what sort of crop protection are we going to need locally? How do we evaluate it in context with the tools of the sustainable use regulation? I mean, this is a challenge, the complexity of which starts even before starting to develop modeling and monitoring that again, I'm not putting aside, right? But this is how we define the way we produce food in Europe, closer, diverse, with crop diversification as well in the equation.
So a more localized way of producing food. Martin Dermine, your views quickly, because we're getting closer to the end now, about how to sell this politically.
Well, politically, I mean, the citizens in every, we mentioned this initiative in Switzerland. In the EU, there were already 2 European citizens initiatives to ask for a ban phasing out of all synthetic pesticides. In the Conference for the Future of Europe, there was a massive demand for a drastic reduction of the use of synthetic pesticides. So politically, it's not difficult to sell. It's selling it to the farming community, reassuring the farming community that they will not go bankrupt because pesticides are banned. Every time we mentioned the neonicotinoids, when the Commission started speaking about banning it directly, farmer union, pesticide industry said, oh, we will have a drop of 50% of the yields, all farmers will go bankrupt. We have to have a scientifically based decisions taken. This is what is being done now with the proposal from the Commission, and we have to reassure the farmers that they will be supported by public authorities no matter what. I think this is really important because they're not happy to destroy the environment, they're not happy to contaminate their neighbors, and we need to show them that the public and politicians are on their side as well.
Okay, Caroline, instead, very briefly on this, and I will go checking the questions from the public while you answer, because I can't see it from here, unfortunately. But please go ahead. How can the Commission sell this?
Well, we have the Green Deal. We have the Farm to Fork strategy. We have now a proposal for a sustainable use regulation. So these are let's say, the big political lines, but I mean, we also have instruments under the CAP. We are funding research, we are funding innovation, we are speeding up alternatives, the microorganisms, so we are doing a lot to support farmers.
Okay, so turning to questions from the audience now. So do the panelists that believe that a new paradigm is needed think the current system is not conservative or protective enough, or because it is not adaptable and responsive enough? That was the question that was the most popular among the audience. Who wants to have a go at this? Maybe Annette Aldrich?
I would say it's all of the above. I mean, I think partially, yes, it is for some organisms or for some compounds, it is not conservative enough. For other substances, it does seem to work and it's efficient. It's also not adaptable and responsive enough because we have so much monitoring data pointing us to a direction. And yes, we can react to monitoring data, but it's just a little bit slow sometimes. Maybe on a national, on a member state level that is different, and I think there's a huge difference between the countries. So coming from Switzerland, I can't really comment on that. But I think to me, it comes again to this communication tool because we have the monitoring data showing there's the biodiversity loss, and then we're doing this single substance, single use assessment. That doesn't translate. It just doesn't translate. You have to communicate it differently and say, no, you are considering the entire application and be responsive in that way. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll jump straight to the next question unless somebody is burning to answer this, because I think we've sort of addressed that question in a way already. So should the system also take into account total environmental impact of a whole crop cycle? And Martin Dermine, you're volunteering for this.
Yes, definitely. I think this is one of the added value that could a system-based environmental risk assessment have, is the fact that crops are sprayed either simultaneously with different pesticides or with different treatments. We mentioned apples earlier today, up to 30 treatments per year in certain countries. We need an assessment on the impact of these crops on the environment, and clearly it's, well, and I think that if we do it well, a lot of pesticides will be removed from the market, but for that we need to have it well-based, well-structured, and then risk managers following with difficult decisions very quickly.
And Alex, maybe you want to say a word about this idea of having an impact looking at the whole crop life cycle?
Yes, certainly. And the first idea that comes to my mind is how do you do that? Considering that the number of practices on, say, an apple orchard is probably dozens of thousands. So the only way to envision how to do such a thing is to record practices in the field. So the good news is that, again, mentioning the sustainable use regulation, there is a clause in there that looks into the record keeping by pesticide users of all the products they use on which crop, when, how many times, etc. And that includes all types of products, obviously, they're going to use. So once you've got that data built up and collected, then that is going to become possible. Yeah. Regarding removing all the pesticides on the market that Martin was mentioning, again, I think if it's a fair decision, there's nothing I can do about that. What, again, we need to acknowledge is that the way those products are being used already today and will be used in the future is going to change drastically through a reduction of, we're talking 50%. It could be much more if you go towards precision applications. It could be 90 in some situations. So before to remove them and to make that decision, I would plea for realism in the risk assessment, the way it's going to be done.
Okay, let me turn now to the last question selected from the audience. A bit technical, but I think Karin Ninstedt can probably answer that. Would the consideration of a mixture in a system approach be compliant with Regulation 1107, which everybody in this room knows by heart, of course?
Thank you for the question. Maybe before I come to the question, just
what is Regulation 1107?
That's the regulation which regulates approval of active substances and authorizations of plant protection products.
All right.
No, but I wanted to come back to the issue of data generation, which was mentioned by Anne, because we have the new SIO, which is Statistical Agricultural Inputs and Outputs, which is now adopted, soon to be adopted. And we are also working towards an electronic record keeping of the use of plant protection products by each user. So there is already in Regulation 1107 the provision that the users need to record what they use, but there were no provisions on how to record it, and sometimes it was difficult to get this information. So now we are working on an implementing act to make these record keeping electronic, which would make the data much, accessible basically, and then if it would be, of course, good for monitoring, good for systemic approaches, good for looking at mixtures in the field, etc., etc. So I think there is progress in the area. Yeah. It will take a little bit of time still, but we are moving there.
So no need to change regulation, but an implementing act that is, or delegated act.
Implementing act.
Implementing act. This is the trend in the Commission these days, it seems. Anybody wants to comment about this compliance with 1107 regulation of a system-based approach? Does anybody else want to comment about this? Martin Hosik? Yeah?
Just a short comment on 1107. I think this is something which I was expecting the Commission to be opening it during the legislature. I'm a bit sad that this is not likely going to happen, because indeed there is a space for improvement and streamlining certain things, the permitting of non-chemical alternatives and so on. It doesn't mean that it's all bad, but I think we should be more ambitious and especially after a while on how we can update it and use the farm to fork. I fully agree that the sustainable use should have come first, and I'm very happy to see it, because there was and I think it's important to say there was a concern until the last moment that it's not going to happen and it's going to be delayed, because the pressure from some member states, including my own country, was massive against it, and that's very sad for me. And yes, for me, it's not, the whole discussion is not whether we have pesticides or not. Even when we are climate neutral, we're going to have some emissions of greenhouse gases. This is about making sure that indeed synthetic pesticides are the tool of last resort, and when we use them wisely and as little as possible. But before that, we have to provide all the tools for the farmers. We have to work with them, we have to help them. And I believe that, if the chemical industry looks at perspective, well, we are in the business of providing help to farmers and not selling them pesticides, they can be, and they should be, really, really important part of the solution. And that's kind of my wish, that we go in it together and understand this is the end. This is not about how many pesticides we sell. We need to have clear targets, I'm all for it, but that we really use it as a last resort. And probably then, 50% is going to be just a milestone away where we go much lower, and especially 100% on the hazardous ones. Yeah. Like, we should not have hazardous pesticides, full stop.
Indeed, there are interesting new business models that can be explored with pesticides among a range of different services that companies can bring. Thank you, Martin Hosik. I think this brings us to the end of this panel debate. Thanks again to all the panelists for joining us today. My main and personal impression from this debate is that indeed the pressure is growing to have a more system-wide approach on pesticides, and the very fact that we're having this discussion now organized by EFSA shows that the demand has also reached not just society but also the policymakers and some of the regulators. But of course now how to translate this into actual policy, this is a whole different question. Which can be sometimes a bit tricky. I think that's all for me, so thanks for your attention, and I now hand over the floor back to Sylvia Pieper and Vanessa Mazerol. Thank you.
I can also speak here.
So thanks a lot to all the contributors, speakers, and the panelists for the discussion. So, yeah, how to begin? The shift of paradigm seems to be needed in view of the answer of the poll. But we see also from the debates that it's not so easy, it's not simple, it's raised some question, and we need a dialogue for that, of course. But we can also learn from what we already know from the past. We have knowledge already that we can build on something. We can build on the existing, because the existing show us some evidence. The current system is based on single organisms, single use, single products. It's not the reality, but it's help us to understand some mechanisms that we can use to build something different, but I don't know if it will be something completely new. As we heard, the regulation aim already to protect the biodiversity, but we know that there is some collapse in biodiversity, so there is something going wrong, maybe in how risk assessors are addressing the environmental risk assessments. So for that, a system-based approach could also help us to better reflect the reality by making use of monitoring data of all the knowledge we have. And I don't speak about the knowledge of the regulator only, but all the academic scientists, the society, and even the political peoples, they have some knowledge and we can build on that. And this is to better reflect the reality and contribute to safeguard our environment. And that will be my take-home message, and Sylvia will complete a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I cannot complete so much. It was already very comprehensive. One thing that I personally learned in this session and also the discussion is that the word system-based approach has a different meaning for all of us, dealing with different aspects of ERA, but also of the wider risk regulation, so not only the risk assessment, but also the management. I have understood that the majority thinks that a system-based approach, whatever it will be, can help understanding better the overall impact of pesticides in the real environment, so not missing to see the forest for the many, many trees that we look at. We have learned that we have the tools and data to implement already now some steps, that some development are expected also in the future, and that in my opinion, even if, and in our discussion, even if the system-based approach is something that needs to be better defined, as you said, to understand how it is implementable, the regulation can accommodate already to it. So system-based approach is more a way of thinking that we should embrace in the different level of ERA that we are working on, or on the wider risk regulation, so that we really try to have this perspective change, to try really to understand how pesticides impact the real world, and that's for me the take-home message. This will start with small steps in the current system and build on as we see what is needed, and this will help us achieve also and probably is the only way that we to achieve the aims of the Green Deal, of the protected environment and sustainable food production, which of course is based on a healthy environment. So every steps that is still needed should not stop us acting now, which this is what I understood. Thank you very much.
So with that, we can close the session. I will thank all in-person virtual audience also for the following the session, for all the comment and question we have raised today. And then I can also invite you to stay connected or be connected to meet some of the session contributors, because we have a virtual lounge that will be open in next minutes. So if you want to meet session contributors and discuss a little bit more, you can, and please join the virtual session. And don't forget that tomorrow, the One Planet track will be resumed at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So you are more than welcome.
Thank you.